The rain fell like icy tears from a grieving sky on the night Clara Brennan decided to disappear from the only home she had ever known. She stood at the servants' entrance of Thornwood Manor, her thin wool cloak doing nothing to protect her from the biting November wind that howled across the Yorkshire moors like a wounded animal. In her arms, she clutched a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned, a few changes of clothing, her mother's prayer book, a tarnished silver locket that held a faded portrait of parents she barely remembered, and the small velvet box she had been too afraid to open for 3 weeks now. Behind her, the great manor rose against the stormy sky like a sleeping giant, its windows dark except for the faint glow of candlelight from the east wing where the Duke of Ashworth kept his private chambers. The same chambers where, 6 weeks ago, Clara had surrendered not just her virtue but her heart to a man who could never truly see her as anything more than a passing fancy. She pressed her hand against her abdomen, still flat beneath her coarse woolen dress, and felt the familiar surge of terror mixed with something far more dangerous: hope. A child. His child. The child of the most powerful duke in all of Yorkshire, a man whose family lineage stretched back to the Norman conquest, whose blood ran as blue as the sapphires that adorned his signet ring. And she was nothing but a maid, a servant girl who had come to Thornwood Manor at 14, orphaned and alone, with nothing but her good name and her willingness to work. Clara closed her eyes and remembered the night that had changed everything. It had been the Harvest Ball, the grandest event Thornwood Manor had hosted in a decade. The great hall had blazed with 1,000 candles, and the finest families from across England had gathered to celebrate the bounty of the season. Clara had been tasked with serving refreshments, moving through the crowd of silk and satin like a ghost in her plain grey dress. She had felt his eyes on her before she saw him. The Duke of Ashworth, Alexander Whitmore, stood in the corner of the room, his dark gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that made her blood heat, despite the chill of the autumn evening. He was devastatingly handsome, with chiseled features, raven black hair that curled slightly at the collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds. Everything about him spoke of power, wealth, and an unshakable confidence that came from a lifetime of being told he could have anything he desired. And that night, for reasons Clara still didn't fully understand, he had desired her. She had tried to avoid him, keeping her head down as she moved through the crowds with her silver tray, but somehow he had cornered her in the small pantry off the main hall, his large body blocking her escape as his eyes roamed over her with a hunger that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "You've been avoiding me, Clara," he had said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "My lord, I have duties to attend to. Duties that can wait." He had stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath and the sandalwood of his cologne. "Do you know how long I've watched you? How many nights I've lain awake, thinking about those eyes of yours?" Clara had tried to protest, to remind him of the vast gulf that existed between them, but the words had died in her throat when he'd reached out and traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. It had been the gentlest touch she'd ever received, and it had undone her completely. She had known it was wrong. She had known that a duke could never truly care for a servant girl. She had known that whatever happened between them would end in heartbreak. But when he had kissed her, when his mouth had claimed hers with such desperate passion that her knees had buckled, she had forgotten everything except the feeling of being wanted. Wanted by a man who could have any woman in England. And now, 6 weeks later, she was paying the price for her foolishness. Clara opened her eyes and looked back at the manor one last time. Somewhere in that vast, cold building, the man she loved was probably sleeping peacefully, dreaming of hunting or politics, or whatever men like him dreamed of. He would never know about the child growing inside her. He would never know about the impossible choice she was about to make. Because if she stayed, she would ruin him. The scandal would be unimaginable. A duke, the most eligible bachelor in the county, fathering a child with a servant. His reputation would be destroyed, his political ambitions crushed, his family's ancient name dragged through the mud. And even if he did the honorable thing and married her, she would spend the rest of her life being whispered about, being treated as a fortune hunter who had trapped him with her feminine wiles. She couldn't bear that. And she couldn't bear the thought of Alexander looking at her with regret in his eyes, wondering if she had planned this all along. So she would leave. She would disappear into the night and start a new life somewhere far away, where no one knew who she was or what she had been. She would raise this child on her own, love it with all her heart, and never speak of the Duke who had fathered it. It was the only way. Clara took one last breath, drawing the cold, wet air into her lungs, and then she stepped out into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through her thin cloak, plastering her hair to her skull and making her shiver violently. But she didn't turn back. She couldn't. If she looked at the manor one more time, she would lose her nerve, and she knew she would never have the courage to leave again. So she walked. Down the long gravel drive, past the stables where the horses slept, through the iron gates that had never once felt like they had let her in, and out onto the open road that stretched toward a future she couldn't even imagine. She had saved £2.07 over the past 3 years of service, a small fortune for a girl in her position. It wasn't enough to buy a house or establish a business, but it was enough to get her to London, to find work, to survive until she could figure out what to do next. She had also taken one other thing, a small velvet box that she hadn't been able to leave behind. Now, as she walked through the storm, Clara stopped under the shelter of an ancient oak tree and opened her satchel. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the box and flipped it open. Inside lay a brooch, a delicate piece of jewelry made of rose gold, and set with a single teardrop pearl. It had been her mother's, the only thing of value her family had ever owned. Clara had been saving it for a special occasion, for a day when she would have someone to pass it on to. Perhaps that day would come. She snapped the box shut and tucked it back into her satchel, then continued walking. The rain was letting up slightly, the clouds beginning to thin and reveal a sliver of moon. Clara looked up at it and made a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening. Please let me be strong. Please let me be brave. And please, please let my child be born into a world where love matters more than birth. She didn't know it then, but on the other side of England, a storm of a different kind was about to break. And the Duke of Ashworth, who had awakened that morning believing he had everything he could ever want, was about to discover that he had lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Alexander Whitmore, the 8th Duke of Ashworth, was a man who had grown up believing that the world was his for the taking. From the moment of his birth, he had been surrounded by wealth, privilege, and the expectation that he would one day assume the mantle of leadership that had been in his family for over 300 years. His father, the late Duke, had been a stern, unfeeling man who had viewed his children as nothing more than assets to be managed and married off to the highest bidder. His mother, a countess's daughter who had been sold to the Whitmore family for her bloodline and her beauty, had died when Alexander was just 8 years old, leaving behind only a vague memory of lavender perfume and a gentle voice that had sung him to sleep. Alexander had learned early that showing emotion was a weakness. He had learned that trust was a currency to be spent carefully. And he had learned that love was a myth perpetuated by poets and novelists who had never had to navigate the treacherous waters of the aristocracy. By the age of 30, he had perfected the art of being the perfect duke. He was feared by his tenants, respected by his peers, and desired by every unmarried woman in the county. His wealth was vast, his estates prosperous, and his political influence growing daily. He had everything a man could want. Or so he had believed. The truth was that Alexander was desperately, achingly lonely. His days were filled with meetings, responsibilities, and the endless performance of being the Duke of Ashworth. His nights were spent in the company of acquaintances who cared nothing for him beyond his title and his fortune. He had never known what it felt like to be truly seen, truly known, truly loved for who he was, rather than what he represented. Until Clara Brennan had walked into his life. She had arrived at Thornwood Manor 3 years ago, a thin, nervous girl with haunted eyes and a quiet dignity that had set her apart from the other servants. She had been assigned to the kitchens initially, but Alexander had noticed her almost immediately. There was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself, the way she looked at the world with such guarded hope that had drawn him in. He had watched her from a distance for months, telling himself it was just curiosity, just boredom, just the idle fancy of a man with too much time and too little purpose. But the truth was that he couldn't stop thinking about her. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with her features, though those were lovely enough, with her wide brown eyes, her honey-colored hair, and her full lips that had a habit of quirking up at the corners when she thought no one was looking. Her beauty was in her resilience, in her refusal to be broken by the hardships that had clearly marked her life, in the quiet strength that radiated from her, like heat from a dying fire. Alexander had tried to stay away. He had tried to remember the vast gulf that existed between them, the impossibility of any relationship that crossed the boundaries of class and station. He had reminded himself of his duty to his family, his title, his position in society. But the heart, he had learned, was not a creature of reason, and when he had finally given in to the temptation of her, when he had kissed her in that pantry, and felt her melt against him, he had known that he was lost. Now, a week after Clara had disappeared, Alexander stood in the abandoned chamber that had once been her room, staring at the narrow cot where she had slept, and the small wooden chest where she had kept her few possessions. She was gone, and he had no idea where she had gone, or why. At first, he had assumed she had simply taken a day to visit the village, to run an errand or see a friend, but as the hours had stretched into days, as the other servants had begun to whisper and glance at him with pitying eyes, the truth had become impossible to ignore. She had left him. The realization had hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Why? He had replayed their last encounter in his mind 1,000 times. They had been in the woods beyond the manor, a secluded spot where they would steal moments of privacy away from prying eyes. He had been in good spirits, having just concluded a successful negotiation with the neighboring estate. He had been joking about something, he couldn't even remember what now, and Clara had laughed, that soft melodic sound that always made his heart lift. He had kissed her forehead, told her he would see her that night, and walked away. That had been the last time he had seen her. 2 days later, she had been reported missing. Now, Alexander picked up a small object that had fallen behind the chest, a torn piece of paper with a few lines of writing in Clara's careful, slanted hand. He recognized it as part of a letter, though it was too damaged to reveal more than a few phrases. Cannot stay. The secret I carry would destroy us both. Love you too much to see you ruined. Will always remember that night in the woods. Alexander's hands tightened on the paper, his knuckles white. What secret? What could Clara possibly be hiding that would destroy them both? The answer came to him like a thunderbolt, sudden and devastating in its clarity. The secret she carries. A child. She was with child. His child. And instead of telling him, instead of giving him the chance to do the right thing, she had fled. She had disappeared into the night, carrying his heir, carrying the one thing that could make him truly happy, carrying his heart with her. Alexander crumpled the paper in his fist and hurled it across the room, a guttural sound of rage and despair tearing from his throat. She had taken his child, and she had left him. He had to find her. He had to find them both. He would spend every penny of his vast fortune if he had to. He would turn over every stone in England if that's what it took. Because for the first time in his life, Alexander Whitmore understood what it meant to lose something truly precious, and he would not rest until he got it back. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Alexander Whitmore had become a man possessed. He had posted notices in every town and village within 100 miles of Thornwood Manor, offering a staggering reward of £500 for any information about a young woman matching Clara's description. He had hired a team of private investigators, dispatched servants to scour the countryside, and even travelled to London himself to search the streets and workhouses where a desperate young woman might seek refuge. Nothing. It was as if Clara Brennan had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The other servants at Thornwood Manor watched their master with a mixture of fear and pity. He had always been stern and demanding, but now there was something else in his eyes, a wild desperation that bordered on madness. He barely slept, barely ate, barely functioned. His estate suffered, his business dealings suffered, his very health suffered. But he didn't care. The only thing that mattered was finding Clara. His friends and advisors tried to reason with him. The Duke of Ashworth was making a fool of himself, they said. A respectable man did not behave with such abandon over a servant girl. It was undignified, unseemly, and would inevitably lead to scandal. Alexander had told them all to go to the devil. He had spent a lifetime being the perfect duke, doing what was expected of him, suppressing his desires and emotions in favor of duty and reputation. And what had it gotten him? Nothing but a cold, empty house and a heart that had only started beating when a brown-eyed maid had smiled at him in the kitchen. He was done with being the perfect duke. Now, he was going to be a man in love, and he would find the woman he loved if it killed him. One evening, about 3 months into his search, Alexander received an unexpected visitor at Thornwood Manor. His aunt, Lady Margaret Whitmore, arrived without warning, sweeping into the great hall with all the drama of a theatrical performance. She was a tall, imposing woman in her 60s, with sharp features and sharper eyes that missed nothing. "Alexander," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "you look terrible. What have you done to yourself?" "Aunt Margaret," Alexander said, his voice flat. "I wasn't expecting you. I can see that." She looked around the great hall with evident disapproval. "This place has gone to seed. The servants are slovenly. The dust is thick on the furniture. And you," she shook her head, "you look like a man who has lost everything." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Aunt Margaret?" "I want to talk some sense into you, of course." She settled into a chair, arranging her skirts with practiced elegance. "I've heard the most disturbing rumors about you, Alexander. Something about a servant girl who has somehow captured your attention." "She's not a servant girl. She's the woman I love." Lady Margaret laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Love? Don't be ridiculous. You're a duke, not a lovesick poet. You have responsibilities, duties, a legacy to uphold. And you've been chasing a servant like some common fool." Alexander felt his blood heat. "I will thank you not to speak of her that way." "Or what?" Lady Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You'll cut me off? Disown me? You can barely manage your own affairs these days." "I've heard about the money you've been spending on your search. The entire fortune of Ashworth, frittered away on chasing a ghost. It's my money to spend as I see fit." "It's your family's money," Lady Margaret corrected sharply. "Money that has been in the Whitmore family for generations. And you're throwing it away on a servant who has clearly used you." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Lady Margaret leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "The girl is gone, isn't she? She took what she wanted and disappeared. It's the oldest trick in the book. Seduce a wealthy man, get pregnant, and then blackmail him for a comfortable living. You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Lady Margaret smiled. "I've seen it before. Women like her, they know exactly what they're doing. They play on a man's weaknesses, his loneliness, his foolish heart, and then they take everything they can and disappear." Alexander stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think you should leave, Aunt Margaret." "Sit down, Alexander." Her voice was cold and commanding. "I'm not finished." "I am." He walked toward the door. "I have nothing more to say to you." Lady Margaret rose from her chair, her face flushed with anger. "You're making a terrible mistake, Alexander. This woman will destroy you, and when she does, don't expect me to be there to pick up the pieces." "It's good then, that I won't need you," Alexander said, and walked out of the room. But her words had found their mark. For the first time, a seed of doubt had been planted in Alexander's mind. What if Clara had used him? What if she had never loved him at all? He refused to believe it. He had seen the way she looked at him, felt the way she trembled in his arms. That wasn't the behavior of a woman who was using him. That was the behavior of a woman who loved him as desperately as he loved her. But the doubt remained, gnawing at him like a persistent ache. And with every passing day, every failed lead, every empty report from his investigators, the doubt grew stronger. What if she was gone forever? What if she had never loved him at all? In a small village in the heart of the Cotswolds, Clara Brennan sat in the kitchen of a modest cottage, her hands wrapped around a chipped cup of tea. She had been in Fairford for 4 months now, working as a seamstress for the village dressmaker, living in a tiny room above the shop. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and a job that kept her occupied and out of sight. And she had her growing belly, which she could no longer hide. Clara looked down at the swell beneath her dress, a miracle of life that she both adored and feared in equal measure. The child inside her kicked, a small flutter that made her smile despite everything. She had no idea how she was going to raise this baby on her own, how she was going to provide for it, how she was going to give it the life it deserved. But she would find a way. She always found a way. The door to the kitchen opened, and Clara looked up to see Mrs. Higgins, the dressmaker's wife, standing in the doorway with a look of concern on her plump, kindly face. "Clara, dear, are you feeling all right? You're looking quite pale." "I'm fine, Mrs. Higgins. Just a little tired, that's all." Mrs. Higgins tutted and moved closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Now, you know you don't have to hide anything from me. I've seen a woman in your condition before, and I know what it means." Clara's eyes widened in alarm. "Mrs. Higgins, you've had no visitors, no sweetheart calling on you, and yet you're expecting a child. I don't need to be a scholar to add those sums." She reached out and patted Clara's hand. "I'm not judging you, dear. Everyone has their secrets. I just want you to know that if you ever need to talk, I'm here." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't told anyone about her past, about the Duke, about the impossible love that had led to her current situation. But Mrs. Higgins's kindness was overwhelming, and before she knew what she was doing, she was pouring out her story in a rush of whispered words. When she was finished, Mrs. Higgins was silent for a long moment, her face thoughtful. "That's quite a story, my girl," she said finally. "And this Duke, you're certain he doesn't know about the child?" Clara shook her head. "I left before I could tell him. I thought it would be better for everyone if I just disappeared. Better for everyone, or better for him?" The question hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, though she already had a sinking feeling she knew what Mrs. Higgins was going to say. "I mean that you made a choice for him, without giving him a say in the matter. You decided that your love wasn't strong enough, that your class difference was too vast, that he would be better off without you. But did you ever ask him what he wanted? Did you ever give him the chance to choose for himself?" Clara was silent, a hot flush of shame spreading across her cheeks. She hadn't asked him. She had assumed she knew what he would say, what he would feel, what he would do. She had let her fears and insecurities make the decision for both of them. What if she had been wrong? Mrs. Higgins sighed, patting Clara's hand again. "You're a good girl, Clara. I can see that. And I can see that you love this man, even if you're too frightened to admit it. But running away from love is never the answer. It just leaves both of you broken and alone." "What should I do?" Clara asked, her voice small. "I don't know," Mrs. Higgins admitted. "But I do know that if you love him, you should give him the chance to love you back, even if it means facing all those fears you've been running from." Clara nodded slowly, her mind racing. Could she do that? Could she go back to Alexander and tell him the truth? Could she face the world that would judge her, that would hate her, that would never accept her as anything more than a servant? She didn't know. But for the first time, she was beginning to wonder if she had made the right choice. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. The weeks passed, and Clara's belly grew rounder. She continued working for Mrs. Higgins, sewing dresses and mending clothes, trying to save as much money as she could for the baby's arrival. The village was small, but the people were kind. They didn't ask questions about where she had come from, or why she was alone. They simply accepted her. But Clara couldn't stop thinking about Alexander. She wondered if he was looking for her. She wondered if he had given up. She wondered if he had moved on with his life, found another woman, someone worthy of his title and his position. The thought made her chest ache with a pain that was almost physical. One evening, Clara was sitting in her tiny room, looking through the few possessions she had brought with her. She opened her satchel and pulled out the velvet box, the one that contained her mother's brooch. She opened the box and looked at the delicate piece of jewelry. the rose gold gleaming in the candlelight. Her mother had worn this brooch on her wedding day. She had worn it when she held Clara for the first time. She had worn it when she held Clara for the first time. She had worn it until the day she died, a victim of the fever that had swept through their village, taking her and Clara's father in a single devastating week. Clara had been just 12 years old, too young to understand the finality of death, too young to know how to survive on her own. She had been sent to the workhouse, had spent 2 years in that cold, miserable place before she had been hired as a maid at Thornwood Manor. And now she was carrying a child of her own, a child who would never know its grandparents, a child who might never know its father. Clara closed the box and pressed it to her heart, tears streaming down her face. She missed Alexander so much it hurt. She missed the sound of his voice, the warmth of his touch, the way he looked at her, as if she was the most precious thing in the world. She missed feeling wanted. She missed feeling loved. And she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that she had made a terrible mistake. She should have stayed. She should have told him about the baby. She should have given him the chance to make his own decision. Instead, she had run away. And now, she might never see him again. The discovery came on a cold February morning. Alexander had been sitting in his study, poring over reports from his investigators, all of which had come up empty, when his butler, Mr. Pemberton, had entered with a letter. "My lord, a message has arrived from one of the villages in the Cotswolds. It seems a woman there may have information about your missing servant." Alexander had grabbed the letter with trembling hands, tearing it open and scanning the contents. The writer was a dressmaker named Mrs. Higgins, who claimed that a young woman matching Clara's description had been working for her for the past several months. She was currently staying above the shop, and she was in what Mrs. Higgins delicately referred to as an interesting condition. The letter ended with a warning. "I do not know if this is the woman you seek, my lord, but if it is, I must caution you against coming in haste and anger. The girl is frightened and alone, and she needs kindness more than she needs confrontation. Please consider this before you set out." Alexander had barely finished reading before he was ordering his carriage prepared. He didn't care about the rain that was lashing against the windows, or the state of the roads that would make the journey treacherous. He didn't care about the warning to be gentle or understanding. All he cared about was that Clara was alive, she was close, and she was carrying his child. The journey took 2 days. By the time Alexander reached the village of Fairford, he was exhausted, soaked through, and barely able to contain his emotions. He found the dressmaker's shop without difficulty, a small establishment on the main street, with a sign bearing the name Higgins and Daughters. Alexander dismounted from his horse, leaving his carriage at the inn, and approached the door with his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to see Clara, the woman he loved, the woman who had fled from him, the woman who was carrying his unborn child. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could make contact, the door opened, and he found himself face to face with Mrs. Higgins. The dressmaker's wife looked him up and down, taking in his expensive clothes and his aristocratic bearing, and then sighed deeply. "I was afraid you might come," she said, stepping aside to let him in, "but I suppose it was inevitable." "Is she here?" Alexander demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Is Clara here?" Mrs. Higgins nodded, her expression troubled. "She's in the back room, working on a dress for the vicar's wife. I didn't tell her you were coming. I thought it might be better if you spoke to her directly." Alexander didn't wait for further instructions. He pushed past Mrs. Higgins and strode through the shop, his eyes scanning for any sign of the woman he had searched for so desperately. He found her in the back room, sitting at a table with a bolt of silk and a needle and thread. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening in shock, and the needle slipped from her fingers. "Alexander?" she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara." He crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees before her, his hands reaching out to grasp hers. "Alexander, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" She pulled her hands away, scrambling backward in her chair. "You shouldn't have come. You need to leave before someone sees." "Before someone sees what?" he interrupted, his voice sharp with desperation. "Before someone sees the woman I love. Before someone sees the mother of my child." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You know," she breathed. "Oh God, you know." "Yes, I know. I found your letter, the one you didn't finish. And I've been searching for you ever since." He reached out and gently took her hand again, this time not letting go when she tried to pull away. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was trying to protect you," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "The scandal would have destroyed you. A duke and a servant. Everyone would have assumed I trapped you, that I was a fortune hunter who used my body to ensnare you." "To hell with what everyone would have assumed," Alexander said fiercely. "To hell with scandal, and reputation, and all the rest of it. I don't care about any of that. I only care about you." Clara shook her head, sobbing. "You don't mean that. You can't mean that." "I mean every word." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I have spent the last 6 months searching for you. I have hired dozens of investigators, posted notices in every town from here to Scotland, and spent a fortune that I would gladly spend 100 times over, if it meant finding you. Do you understand what that means, Clara? Do you understand what you are to me?" "I was trying to do the right thing," she whispered. "I thought if I left, if I just disappeared, it would be easier for everyone." "It was the wrong thing," Alexander said, his voice cracking. "The wrong thing for me, the wrong thing for our child, the wrong thing for us." "Us?" Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with confusion. "What us? There is no us, Alexander. We shared one night of passion, one beautiful night that I will treasure for the rest of my life. But that doesn't change who we are. I am a servant, and you are a duke. We can never—" "We can never what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "We can never be together? We can never raise our child as a family? We can never love each other openly and honestly?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice breaking. "That's exactly what I mean. There are rules, Alexander. There are boundaries that people like you don't cross. I could never be accepted in your world. I would only drag you down, destroy your reputation, ruin everything you've worked to build." "I don't care about any of that," Alexander said. "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, being the perfect duke, living up to my family's legacy. And do you know what it has cost me? It has cost me everything. It has cost me the woman I love, and the child I should have been raising." He was crying now, tears streaming down his face, and he didn't care. He was done pretending to be strong. "I will give up everything," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "My title, my estate, my fortune, none of it matters without you. I would be a pauper if it meant I could have you and our child." Clara stared at him, her face a mask of shock. She had never seen him like this before. She had seen the duke, the aristocrat, the man of power and privilege. She had never seen the vulnerable, desperate man who was kneeling before her now, begging her to believe in him. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to collect himself. "I came here for a reason, Clara. I didn't come to force you to come back. I came to ask you if you would give me the chance to prove myself, to prove that I can be the man you deserve, to prove that our love can overcome any obstacle." He pulled the small velvet box from his pocket, the same one she had taken with her when she fled the manor. "You left this behind," he said softly. "Your mother's brooch. I found it when I was searching your room." Clara gasped, reaching for the box. "Oh, Alexander, I thought I had lost it forever." "You didn't lose it," he said, pressing it into her hands. "And I'm not going to lose you. Not again. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much you are loved. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel like you have to run away again." Clara was sobbing openly now, her shoulders shaking with the force of her emotions. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and she buried her face in his chest. "I was so afraid," she whispered. "I was so afraid that you wouldn't want me, that you would think I was trying to trap you, that you would hate me for getting pregnant." "Never," he said fiercely. "I could never hate you. I could never want anyone but you. You are everything to me, Clara. Everything." They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in the warm light of the cottage kitchen. Outside, the rain had started to fall again, but inside, There was only warmth. "I don't know how to do this," Clara finally said, pulling back to look at him. "I don't know how to be a duchess. I don't know how to navigate the society you live in. I'm just a servant, Alexander. I don't belong in your world." "You belong wherever I am," he said firmly, "and I'll teach you everything you need to know. We'll learn together. We'll face the world together. But I won't ask you to stay because I have the power to make you. I'll spend the rest of my life becoming someone you can freely choose." Clara looked into his eyes, searching for any trace of doubt, any hint that he might be saying this just to get what he wanted. But all she saw was sincerity, honesty, and a love so pure and bright, it took her breath away. "Promise me you won't regret this," she said softly. "Promise me that when the world starts to judge us, when the whispers start, you won't wish you had let me go." "I will never regret choosing you," Alexander said, "and I will spend every moment of every day proving to you that you made the right choice in trusting me." They married in a small village church, with only Mrs. Higgins and her husband as witnesses. It wasn't the grand affair that Alexander's family had expected for the Duke of Ashworth's wedding, but it was perfect for Clara. She wore her mother's brooch on her simple cream gown, and Alexander held her hand throughout the ceremony as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Clara felt a surge of joy so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She was married. She was married to the man she loved, and she was carrying his child. The honeymoon was brief. Alexander was needed at Thornwood Manor to deal with the fallout of their marriage. And that fallout, Clara soon discovered, was devastating. The news had spread through aristocratic society like wildfire. The Duke of Ashworth, one of the most eligible bachelors in England, had married a servant. The scandal was the talk of every drawing room from London to York. Whispers followed them everywhere, and Clara could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Alexander's family was the worst. His mother had been dead for years, but his father's sister, Lady Margaret Whitmore, had taken it upon herself to express the family's outrage. She had arrived at Thornwood Manor 3 days after the wedding, sweeping into the great hall with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. Alexander had tried to protect Clara from Lady Margaret's venom, but there was no escaping it. "A servant," Lady Margaret had said, her voice dripping with contempt. "My nephew, the Duke of Ashworth, has married a servant. I suppose we should be grateful she isn't a common whore from the streets." Clara had flinched at the words, but she held her head high. She had been prepared for this. She had known the price of loving a duke, and she was willing to pay it. Alexander had stepped forward, his voice cold and hard. "Lady Margaret, I will thank you to remember that this woman is my wife. If you cannot show her respect, you are not welcome in my home." Lady Margaret had laughed, a cruel sound that echoed off the marble walls. "Your home? Is this still your home? Or have you abandoned it for the servants' quarters?" Alexander's face had gone white with rage, and Clara had reached out to take his hand, squeezing it gently. "Please," she whispered, "it's not worth it." "I will not have anyone speak to you that way," Alexander had said through gritted teeth. "Not even my own family." But Lady Margaret's words had struck a blow, and they had been followed by many more. The other servants at Thornwood Manor were no better. They had worked alongside Clara for years, but now they regarded her with jealousy and resentment. How had she, a simple maid, managed to marry the Duke? What had she done to ensnare him? What secrets had she used to trap him? Clara could hear the whispers everywhere she went. They said she had seduced him with her body. They said she had lied about being pregnant to force him into marriage. They said she was nothing but a scheming, ambitious harlot who had destroyed one of England's finest families. The cruelty was relentless, and the worst part was that Clara couldn't deny it. She had slept with Alexander before they were married. She had gotten pregnant with his child, and she had left him, which had made him desperate enough to come after her. To the world, it must have looked exactly like what they were saying. Alexander tried everything to make Clara feel welcomed and accepted. He showered her with gifts, took her on long walks through the estate, introduced her to the few friends he had left, who were willing to accept their marriage. But it wasn't enough. Clara was drowning in a world she didn't understand, surrounded by people who hated her for no reason other than her birth. She was carrying Alexander's child, but she had never felt more alone. One evening, about 2 months after their wedding, Clara was in the nursery, preparing for the arrival of her baby. The child was due any day now, and she was both excited and terrified. She was folding tiny blankets when the door opened, and Alexander came in. His face was drawn, his eyes troubled. "What's wrong?" Clara asked immediately. Alexander came to her side and took her hands. "There's something I have to tell you." Clara's heart lurched. "What is it? What's happened?" "Lady Margaret is threatening to take legal action to have our marriage annulled," Alexander said heavily. "She claims that you only married me under false pretenses, that you lied about the child to trap me." Clara's blood went cold. "That's insane. She can't. She's powerful, Clara. She has connections in the House of Lords, friends in the church. She's been spreading lies about you, turning everyone against us." "What kind of lies?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "She's saying that you were never really a servant, that you were planted in my household by a rival family to ruin me. She's saying that the child isn't mine, that you were already pregnant when you came to Thornwood Manor." Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's monstrous. How could anyone believe such things?" "Because people want to believe them," Alexander said bitterly. "It's easier for them to believe that you're a scheming villainess than to accept that I married for love." Clara sank onto the edge of the crib, her legs giving out. "What are we going to do?" "I'm going to fight her," Alexander said fiercely. "I'm going to expose her lies for what they are. I'm not going to let her destroy our family." "But what if she wins?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "What if she manages to have our marriage annulled? What would happen to our child?" "It won't happen," Alexander said. "I won't let it." But even as he said it, there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. Lady Margaret was powerful, and she had resources that Alexander didn't. The days that followed were filled with tension and fear. Lady Margaret had hired a team of lawyers, and they were preparing a case to present to the ecclesiastical courts. They were claiming that Clara had used deception to secure the marriage, that Alexander had been manipulated and tricked into believing she was carrying his child. Alexander's lawyers were fighting back, but it was an uphill battle. The legal system was stacked against them. Clara was a servant, and her word meant nothing against the word of a powerful aristocrat. Alexander spent hours in meetings with his lawyers, trying to find a way to counter Lady Margaret's claims, but every avenue they explored seemed to lead to a dead end. And all the while, Clara watched him grow thinner, more exhausted, more desperate. She could see the strain wearing on him, and she knew it was because of her, because of their marriage, because of their love. One evening, about a week before the court case was scheduled to begin, Clara made a decision. Clara found Alexander in his study, staring into the fire with a glass of brandy in his hand. She walked over to him and knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. "Alexander," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "What is it, my love?" "I need to leave," she said. "What?" Alexander sat up abruptly, nearly spilling his brandy. "No, absolutely not. We've been through this. I'm not letting you go again." "Listen to me," Clara said, her voice calm and steady. "Lady Margaret is going to destroy you. She's going to take everything you have, your title, your estate, your family legacy, and it's all because of me." "It's not because of you," Alexander said fiercely. "It's because of her own hatred and ambition." "Maybe," Clara said, "but that doesn't change the reality. If I leave, if I renounce our marriage, she'll have no reason to continue with the court case. You'll be free. You can rebuild your life." "I don't want a life without you," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "I would rather lose everything than lose you." "And that's exactly why I have to leave," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "Because I love you too much to let you destroy yourself for me." Alexander reached out and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I won't let you go," he whispered. "I can't. You're the only thing that makes sense in my life. The only thing that's ever made sense." "Alexander." "No." He pulled back, cupping her face in his hands. "Listen to me. You said you wanted me to earn your trust. You said you wanted to be able to freely choose. Well, I'm asking you to trust me now. Trust me to fight for us. Trust me to find a way." Clara looked into his eyes, seeing the desperation there, the love, the determination. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could overcome this together. But the fear was still there, gnawing at her heart. "What if you can't?" she whispered. "What if she wins? What happens to us then?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted, "but I know that I'd rather face whatever comes with you by my side than face a life without you." Clara closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. She had wanted to protect him. She had wanted to sacrifice herself for him. But he was asking her to stay, to fight, to believe in their love. And she realized, with a sudden clarity, that she had been wrong. She had been wrong to run away. She had been wrong to make decisions for him. She had been wrong to let her fears control her life. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll stay. I'll fight. I'll trust you." Alexander kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that left her breathless. "Thank you," he murmured against her lips. "Thank you for believing in me." The court case was set to begin in just 3 days. Alexander and Clara had spent every waking moment preparing, going over documents, meeting with lawyers, trying to find a way to counter Lady Margaret's claims. But the odds were against them. Lady Margaret had the power of the establishment behind her. She had the connections, the influence, the money to make this case go her way. And then, on the night before the trial was set to begin, Alexander made a discovery that changed everything. He had been going through his father's old papers, looking for anything that might help their case, when he found a letter that had been hidden in the back of a drawer. The letter was from his mother, written shortly before her death. In it, she revealed a secret that Alexander had never known. His father, the late Duke, had not been his biological father. Alexander was the son of his mother's lover, a man she had met before her arranged marriage to the Duke. The marriage had been a cold, loveless affair, and his mother had found comfort in the arms of another man. Alexander had been conceived in that affair, and his father had known the truth all along. He had accepted Alexander as his son, had raised him as his heir, had never spoken of the secret to anyone. But now, the truth was out. And Alexander realized that Lady Margaret had known. She had known all along, and she had been using that knowledge to control him, to manipulate him, to destroy him. But she had made one mistake. She had given Alexander the key to his own freedom. If the truth about Alexander's parentage came out, his title would be void. He would no longer be the Duke of Ashworth. The title would pass to his cousin, a distant relative who had no interest in the estate or the responsibilities that came with it. But that also meant that Alexander would be free to marry whomever he wanted. Without the title, without the estate, without the legacy of the Whitmore name, he would be just an ordinary man. And he would be able to marry Clara without any legal objections. Alexander read the letter 3 times, his mind racing. He had a choice. He could keep the secret and fight Lady Margaret in court, risking everything he had. Or he could expose the truth and lose everything, but gain his freedom. He walked to the door of the study and opened it. Clara was waiting in the hallway, her eyes filled with concern. "Alexander? What is it? What happened?" He took her hands, looking into her eyes. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Something that's going to change everything." Alexander led Clara to a chair and sat down beside her, still holding her hands. "The letter I found," he began, "was from my mother. She wrote it shortly before she died." "What does it say?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. Alexander took a deep breath. "It says that my father was not my biological father. My mother was in love with another man before her arranged marriage to the Duke. I was conceived in that affair." Clara gasped, her eyes widening with shock. "Alexander, that's terrible," he finished, "and liberating." "Liberating?" Clara stared at him. "How can that possibly be liberating?" "Because Lady Margaret knows about it," Alexander said. "She's known all along, and she's been using it to control me, to manipulate me, to destroy my marriage. What are you going to do?" Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I'm going to expose the truth," he said. I'm going to announce it publicly, and I'm going to renounce my claim to the title." Clara's jaw dropped. "Alexander, you can't. Your title, your estate, your legacy, everything you've worked for." "Everything I've worked for has been a lie," Alexander said. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to expectations that were never really mine. I've been a puppet, manipulated by my family, my advisors, everyone around me." He squeezed her hands, his voice softening. "But you never manipulated me. You never wanted me for my title or my money. You loved me for who I am, and that's the only thing that matters." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't let you do this. I can't let you give up everything for me." "You're not letting me do anything," Alexander said. "This is my choice, my decision, and it's the most right thing I've ever done." "But your family—" "My family has never truly been my family," Alexander said. "They've been a burden, a weight I've carried my whole life. And I'm done carrying it." Clara looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of doubt, any trace of hesitation. But all she saw was certainty. He loved her, and he was willing to give up everything for her. And she realized, with a surge of joy, that she would do the same for him. "Okay," she whispered. "If this is what you want, then I'll support you. I'll stand by you, no matter what happens." Alexander kissed her, a long, slow, tender kiss that said more than words ever could. "Thank you," he murmured. "Thank you for being my strength." The next day, Alexander called a meeting of his family and advisors, in the great hall of Thornwood Manor. Lady Margaret was there, her face smug and triumphant. She was certain she would emerge victorious from the court case, certain that she had finally brought down her rebellious nephew. But Alexander had a surprise for her. He stood at the head of the table, looking out at the assembled group with a calm that surprised everyone. "I have an announcement to make," he said. "A few days ago, I discovered a letter written by my mother, shortly before her death." Lady Margaret's face went pale. "The letter," Alexander continued, "revealed that I am not my father's son. I was conceived in an affair my mother had before her marriage to the Duke." There was a collective gasp from the assembled guests. "This is a lie," Lady Margaret said, her voice trembling. "A fabrication designed to protect your servant wife." "It's not a lie," Alexander said. "And I have the letter to prove it." He pulled out the letter, holding it up for everyone to see. "Here, in my mother's own handwriting, she confesses everything, and I know that you knew about it, Aunt Margaret. You've known about it all along." Lady Margaret's face was ashen, her hands shaking. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Alexander said. "You've been using this secret to control me, to manipulate me, to try to destroy my marriage. But I'm done being your puppet. I'm done living a lie." He looked around the room, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I am renouncing my claim to the title of Duke of Ashworth," he said. "I will no longer be a part of this family's legacy. I will no longer be controlled by their lies and manipulations." The room erupted in chaos. People were shouting, arguing, trying to make sense of what he had just said. But Alexander didn't care. He walked over to Clara, who was standing in the doorway, and took her hand. "Let's go," he said softly. They walked out of the great hall together, leaving behind the chaos and the shouting and the lies. They walked through the halls of Thornwood Manor, past the servants who had once treated Clara with such contempt, past the portraits of ancestors whose approval she would never have. They walked out into the garden, where the sun was shining and the birds were singing. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she could breathe. Alexander and Clara moved into a small cottage on the edge of the estate. It was modest, a far cry from the grandeur of Thornwood Manor, but it was theirs. And it was enough. Alexander had lost his title, his estate, his fortune. But he had gained something far more valuable. He had gained his freedom. He had gained the ability to live his life on his own terms. And he had gained the woman he loved. Clara gave birth to their daughter 2 weeks later, a beautiful baby girl with dark hair and bright eyes. They named her Sophia, after Alexander's mother. It was a way of honoring the woman who had sacrificed so much for love, who had carried the burden of her secret for so many years. And it was a way of reminding themselves that love was worth fighting for. The months that followed were not easy, but they were beautiful. Alexander found work as a steward for a neighboring estate, using his knowledge of agriculture and business to help the owner manage his lands. Clara continued to work as a seamstress, mending and creating clothes for the families in the village. They lived simply, but they were happy. Sophia grew, and she was the joy of their lives. She had Alexander's dark hair and Clara's brown eyes, and she had a spirit that was all her own. She was brave and curious and kind, and she was the best thing that had ever happened to them. But there was still a shadow hanging over their lives. Lady Margaret had not given up. She had been humiliated by Alexander's revelation, and she was determined to get revenge. She had spread lies about them in the village, convincing people that Clara was a fortune hunter and Alexander was a fool. The villagers, who had once been so kind to Clara, now turned against her. They whispered when she walked down the street. They refused to do business with her. They made her feel like an outcast in her own home. And Clara started to wonder if they had made a mistake. Had they been foolish to think they could escape their past? Had they been naive to believe that love could conquer all? The doubts crept in, slow and insidious, poisoning her happiness. It was a cold winter evening when Clara finally broke. Sophia was asleep in her crib, and Alexander was still at work, trying to make ends meet. Clara was sitting in the tiny kitchen, staring at the fire, when the tears started. She couldn't stop them. They came in a flood, washing away all the hope and joy she had been holding on to. She had given up everything for love. She had sacrificed her dignity, her reputation, her future. And for what? To be treated like an outcast, to be whispered about, to be hated by everyone she met. She heard the door open, and Alexander walked in. He took one look at her face and rushed to her side. "Clara, what's wrong? What happened?" She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Can't do what?" "This," she said, gesturing around the tiny cottage. "This life, pretending that everything is fine when it's not, pretending that I don't care what people think when I do." Alexander knelt down in front of her, taking her hands. "Tell me what happened." "The villagers," she said, her voice breaking. "They hate me. They think I'm a fortune hunter, a schemer, a liar. They won't even look at me when I walk down the street." "I know," Alexander said quietly. "And I'm sorry. I'm sorry I dragged you into this life." "You didn't drag me," Clara said. "I chose this. I chose you. But I never knew it would be this hard. I never knew how much I would have to sacrifice." "Maybe we were wrong," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "Maybe we were naive to think we could make this work." Clara looked at him, seeing the pain in his eyes, the doubt. "No," she said, her voice firming. "We weren't wrong. We made the right choice." "Then why does it feel so wrong?" Alexander asked. Clara reached out and cupped his face in her hands. "Because it's hard," she said. "Because love is never easy, but it's worth it. It's worth every sacrifice, every hardship, every tear." Alexander looked into her eyes, seeing the strength there. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you stay so strong?" "I'm not strong," Clara said. "I'm terrified, but I'm also determined. I'm determined to prove them wrong. I'm determined to show them that love is stronger than hate." Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I love you," he whispered. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Clara whispered back. "And that's all that matters." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the warm light of the fire. And in that moment, they knew that they would survive. No matter what the world threw at them, they would survive. Because they had each other. And that was all they needed. The turning point came on a spring morning, about 6 months after they had left Thornwood Manor. Alexander was working in the fields when a messenger arrived with an urgent letter. It was from his cousin, the man who had inherited the Ashworth title. The letter was brief. Lady Margaret had been found dead in her home, apparently of natural causes. But before she died, she had written a confession, admitting to all the lies she had told about Alexander and Clara. She had admitted that Clara had never been a fortune hunter. She had admitted that the child was truly Alexander's. She had admitted that she had fabricated the legal case out of spite and jealousy. Alexander read the letter 3 times, unable to believe his eyes. And then he ran home to tell Clara. Clara was in the garden, playing with Sophia, when Alexander arrived. He was breathless, his eyes shining with tears. "Clara," he said, falling to his knees in front of her. "Clara, I have something to tell you." "What is it?" she asked, her heart pounding with fear. "Lady Margaret is dead," he said. "And she confessed everything. She admitted that she lied about us, about our marriage, about everything." Clara stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. That means we're free," Alexander said. "We're finally free." Clara burst into tears, and Alexander pulled her into his arms. They held each other, Sophia between them, and they cried. They cried for all the pain they had endured. They cried for all the years they had lost. And they cried for the beautiful future that lay ahead of them. The news of Lady Margaret's confession spread quickly through the village. Suddenly, the people who had been so cruel to Clara were coming to her door, apologizing, begging for her forgiveness. They had been wrong about her, they said. They had been fooled by Lady Margaret's lies. Clara accepted their apologies, but she didn't let them back into her life. She had learned a valuable lesson. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their acceptance. All she needed was Alexander and Sophia. And she had them. Alexander's cousin, the new Duke of Ashworth, offered to restore Alexander's title and property, but Alexander declined. He had realized, over the past year, that he didn't want to be a duke. He wanted to be a husband and a father. He wanted to live a simple life, free from the pressures and expectations of the aristocracy. He wanted to be happy. And he was. Years passed, and Clara and Alexander's life became everything they had ever dreamed of. They had 2 more children, a son named Henry and another daughter named Alice. Their cottage was small, but it was filled with laughter and love. Alexander had become the steward of the estate, a position that allowed him to use his knowledge and skills without the burden of title and responsibility. He was respected and admired by the villagers, who had come to see him as a good and honest man. Clara had started a small business, creating beautiful dresses for the families in the surrounding area. Her work was in high demand, and she had become a successful businesswoman in her own right. But their greatest joy was each other. Every evening, after the children were asleep, Alexander and Clara would sit on the porch of their cottage, watching the sun set over the fields. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one evening, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "Giving up everything for me?" Alexander laughed, a warm, rich sound. "Regret it?" He shook his head. "Clara, giving up everything was the best thing I ever did. It taught me what truly matters in life." "What does truly matter?" Clara asked. Alexander turned to look at her, his eyes shining with love. "You," he said. "Our children, our family, that's all that matters." Clara smiled, a soft, dreamy expression on her face. "I love you, Alexander," she said. "I love you too," he said, "and I always will." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. And Clara thought about everything they had been through. The fear, the pain, the sacrifice, and the love. She thought about the night she had fled Thornwood Manor, pregnant and alone, thinking she was protecting Alexander. She thought about the months she had spent in hiding, terrified of being found. She thought about the moment Alexander had walked into that dressmaker's shop, his eyes filled with love and desperation. She thought about the court case, the lies, the sacrifice. She thought about Lady Margaret and the pain she had caused. And she thought about the lesson she had learned. Love was not about possession. It was not about control. It was about trust, respect, sacrifice, and the freedom to choose. Alexander had not forced her to come back to him. He had let her choose, and she had chosen him. Every single time. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Inside the cottage, their children were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the sacrifices that had been made for their happiness. Alexander reached out and took Clara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I spent a fortune searching for you," he said softly. Clara looked at him, a smile playing on her lips. "I know. At first, I thought that money could bring you back to me. I thought that wealth and power would be enough to make you see how much I loved you." "And what did you learn?" she asked. Alexander turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a lifetime of love and gratitude. "I learned that a person isn't valuable because of their title, their wealth, or their family name. I learned that true love cannot be bought, commanded, or forced. It must be earned through trust, respect, sacrifice, and the freedom to choose." Clara smiled, her heart full to bursting. "You taught me that," Alexander continued. "You taught me that I was more than just a title. You taught me that I could be a good man, a loving husband, a devoted father. You taught me what truly matters in life." "And what is that?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Alexander smiled and pulled her close. "You," he said. "Our children. Our love. That's all that matters." He kissed her softly, a tender kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness. And Clara knew, with absolute certainty, that she had made the right choice. She had chosen love over fear. She had chosen trust over doubt. She had chosen Alexander over everything. And she would never regret it. Not for a single moment. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs to hear that love is worth fighting for. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Clara's shoes? Would you have run, or would you have stayed and fought for the man you loved? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe, and turn on that notification bell, so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Until next time, remember, true love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone worth fighting for.